Welcome to U.S. Poverty in the Midst of Prosperity. This is week 3. This week we're looking at African Americans and poverty in the United States. Let's start with the U.S. Constitution, which was ratified in 1788, in the Bill of Rights, that is, the first 10 amendments, in 1789. You'll recall that Article 1, Section 3, called the 3/5 Clause of the U.S. Constitution, stated that the U.S. House of Representatives would be based upon total population counting slaves as 3/5 of a person. In 1793, the U.S. Congress passed the first Fugitive Slave Act, requiring runaway slaves to be returned to their masters. Over the years, pro-slavery and anti-slavery institutions of the Constitution were based upon a number of sections, namely, back in 2009, to celebrate the bicentennial of the birth of Abraham Lincoln, I produced an exhibit on Lincoln for the Behringer Crawford Museum in Covington. It consisted of a number of different panels as well as some really fantastic artifacts. You'll see a couple of those panels in this slide presentation today. In preparation for one of those panels, I put together this, I think, very good overview of the U.S. Constitution, and in the one column, pro-slavery interpretations and anti-slavery interpretations, which really do give you an idea of, how the Constitution over the years has been open to interpretation. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is called the General Welfare and Necessary and Proper Clause. Those are the two clauses. The Congress shall have power to provide the common defense and general welfare of the United States, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all powers vested by this Constitution. These two clauses, the general welfare and necessary and proper clauses, have been used a lot in interpretation of the Constitution over the years. And of course, pro-slavery advocates could argue that the U.S. Congress was not specifically given the right to regulate slavery. Anti-slavery interpretation was that because of this, the U.S. Congress had the right to regulate slavery. Article 4, Section 3, Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. We're going to see how this plays out in a few minutes here. Pro-slavery people said this only applied to territories that the U.S. owned at the time that the Constitution was written, namely the Northwest Territory, that it did not apply to territories after the Constitution was written, so the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican Cession, etc. Anti-slavery interpretation, which would include people like gradual emancipationists and abolitionists, said that this applied to all territories, even those obtained after the Constitution was written. Then the Fifth Amendment is sometimes called the Due Process Law, that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The pro-slavery interpretation regarded slaves as property, and property that could be moved from place to place. The anti-slavery view was regarded slaves as human beings, not property. Hence, if slaves were moved to a free state or territory, anti-slavery proponents said that those slaves became free. And then the States' Rights Amendment, which was really very crucial to an understanding of what happens in the Civil War, and is still crucial to an understanding of how some people in the United States regard such issues as same-sex marriage and a number of other issues, abortion, etc. The 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively. Now, pro-slavery interpretation would be that the states preceded the formation of the Union, giving them the right to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional within their own state lines. Hence, according to this view, slavery was a states' rights issue, not a federal one. The anti-slavery interpretation was the formation of the Union preceded the states. So this one is the states preceded the Union. This is the Union preceded the states. Therefore, slavery was a federal issue, not a states' rights one. Just to review your American history for you, here are the original 13 colonies. After the American Revolution, then this is the United States as of 1783 at the Treaty of Paris. The Louisiana Purchase was bought from France, from Napoleon in 1803. Texas was annexed in 1845, and then the Mexican cession after the Mexican-American War in 1848, Oregon Country in 1846, so on and so forth. Now, this was from that exhibition that I spoke of at the Beringer Crawford Museum. And I think this is very important for us to understand. So we're going to read through this. Abraham Lincoln was a great admirer of Henry Clay of Kentucky, a Whig Party leader and longtime Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. Known as the Great Compromiser, Clay was instrumental in the passage of the two Missouri Compromises of 1820-21, as well as the Compromise of 1850. These compromises were an attempt to keep civil war at bay by appeasing both pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. The Missouri Compromise prohibited the extension of slavery into the territories north of 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude, with the exception of Missouri. The Compromise of 1850 dealt with the territory ceded to the U.S. at the end of the Mexican-American War. By its terms, California was admitted as a free state, but the rest of the newly acquired Mexican territory was to be decided by popular sovereignty. In addition, the slave trade, although not slavery itself, was abolished in the District of Columbia. Finally, a new and more strict Federal Fugitive Slave Act was passed. Clay's death in 1852 left a void in American politics, and the Whig Party eventually dissolved. This is what the Missouri Compromise did. Now, there was always this worry of having the number of slave states and the number of free states to be equal. So if a new state was to come into the Union and it was going to be a free state, then they wanted to counterbalance that with a state coming into the Union as a slave state. And the reason for that is because in the U.S. Senate, each state had 2 U.S. senators. Okay, so Maine is wanting to come in 1820 as a free state, Missouri in 1821 as a slave state, and that was the reason for the Missouri Compromise. So the southern boundary of Missouri was this particular longitude line, which is 36 degrees 30 minutes, and so everything north of this line was to be free by the Missouri Compromise of 1820, with the exception of Missouri itself. Now, those compromises that Henry Clay helped to bring about, the Missouri Compromises, there were actually 2 of those, and the Compromise of 1850. As we just said, Henry Clay died in 1852, and things were never quite the same after his death. To facilitate the building of a transcontinental railroad from Chicago, U.S. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This act was designed to open the territories west of Missouri and Iowa to settlement. To gain Southern votes for the project, Douglas added an amendment to the bill that would allow popular sovereignty, that is, the people themselves, to decide the issue of slavery there. The Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively repealed Henry Clay's Missouri Compromise and its prohibition of slavery north of 3630 latitude. With its passage, the Kansas-Nebraska Act split and doomed the Whig Party. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery passions were inflamed. So now, by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the U.S. Congress has effectively repealed Henry Clay's Missouri Compromise. Now, the issue of slavery now made its way to the United States Supreme Court, whose Chief Justice was Roger Brooke Taney. Originally of a slaveholding family, Taney freed his own slaves, believing that slavery was immoral. Nevertheless, Taney was a firm supporter of states' rights, and you all know what that is because we just told you what states' rights was. Hence, he held that the issue of slavery should be decided by the individual states, not by the federal government. The Taney Court would decide Scott v. Sanford, more popularly known as the Dred Scott decision. And here is Dred Scott here, there is Roger Taney there, and Stephen Douglas there. Dred Scott was a Missouri slave who had been moved by his owner, an Army surgeon named Dr. John Emerson, to the Free State of Illinois, and then to the Free Territory of Wisconsin. In 1842, Dred Scott was returned to St. Louis, Missouri, where Dr. Emerson later died. So he went from a slave state to a free state, and then to a free territory, then back to a slave state. In 1846, Dred Scott sued for his freedom in a Missouri court. Meanwhile, Mrs. Emerson remarried, moved out of state, and left the case in the hands of her brother, John F. A. Sanford. A series of appeals eventually led the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the defendant's last name was misspelled as Sanford. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that Congress did not have the constitutional power to abolish slavery in the territories. Therefore, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. So in other words, now the Taney Court in the Dred Scott decision has said that Congress doesn't have the power to abolish slavery in the territories. These are the territories before they become states. So see what has happened? The Missouri Compromise has totally disappeared. Abolitionists and others who are against slavery have no more recourse, really, to the U.S. Congress because the U.S. Congress is not touching the matter. They're going to let the people decide it. And the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled on the matter. So if you were an anti-slavery adherent, if you were against slavery, you really only had one other place to turn, and that would be the last branch of government, the executive branch. That would be the presidency. Now you see why the election of Lincoln becomes vitally important. The Dred Scott decision also said that blacks could be citizens of states, but not citizens of the United States. Amazing. And it said further that slaves were property protected by the U.S. Constitution. So this shows the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which repealed the Missouri Compromise, and then anti-slavery supporters turned to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so what had been free by Missouri Compromise was now open to slavery in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it would be determined by popular sovereignty. And then this, of course, is the result of the Dred Scott decision. And it shows the free states, the slave states, and the territories which were open to slavery by the Dred Scott decision. So basically, every new territory there was open to slavery. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision were grave disappointments to anti-slavery advocates. Both Congress and the Supreme Court had taken bold steps to expand the hold of slavery upon the nation. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces battled in Kansas in the summer of 1856. Meanwhile, the nation was dividing further along ethnic lines. The American Know-Nothing Party fueled nativist and anti-Catholic sentiments with its presidential candidate Millard Fillmore in 1856. With the Whig Party so split that it did not even field a candidate in the election of 1856, a new party rose to the national stage, the Republican Party. Founded in 1854, it included many Free Soilers who exposed the expansion of slavery in the territory, as well as many Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats. In 1856, its presidential candidate was John C. Fremont, pictured here. The Democratic Party, fractured by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, met in none other than Cincinnati in 1856 to choose its presidential candidate. Northern Democrats opposed the nomination of Stephen A. Douglas, the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and President Franklin Pierce, a steadfast supporter of it. James Buchanan of Pennsylvania was the compromise candidate, running on a ticket with vice presidential candidate John C. Breckinridge of Lexington, Kentucky. And here's Buchanan, and here's Breckinridge. Although Buck and Breck, as they called, were the victors, they only won 45% of the vote in a three-way race between Buchanan, Fremont, and Fillmore. In northern Kentucky and Cincinnati, Buck and Breck were the clear victors, as seen here in this table. You all know the rest of the history, that the Civil War results in 1860, in the election of 1860, when President Lincoln is elected, and then he becomes president in March of 1861, the southern states begin to secede because they don't like Lincoln's views on slavery. The Civil War results, 1861 to 1865, but we often study the battles of the Civil War, the generals of the Civil War, but we seldom really talk about the Civil War and its impact economically and also socially. 4 million slaves were freed as a result of the Civil War. Slaves which economically before this time had been regarded as property. There was an immense destruction in human lives. 620,000 people died as a result of 4 years of Civil War. And well, probably most of you didn't realize 2/3 of them died from disease. The economic cost, and this is something you will rarely ever see in textbooks. I looked at quite a number of my U.S. textbooks for this and ended up having to put together a number of different articles and to put all this together. There were direct costs of the Civil War, things like, military equipment and apparatus, and there were also indirect costs of the Civil War as well. And if you put all of those things together in nominal, and I put nominal sums of money are in the dollars of that day. They're not in terms of what they would be today, which would be real versus nominal. So in the dollars of the day, $10.4 billion is probably about as good of an estimate anyone is going to get of the direct and indirect cost of the Civil War. Now, at the end of the Civil War, the whole, and you know what a GDP is, gross domestic product, because we studied that in the first week and in our first lecture. That means really the entire economy of the United States. The entire economy of the United States in 1865 in nominal, that is $1865, was almost $10 billion. So basically the Civil War cost what the entire economy of the United States was. In fact, more than the entire economy of the U.S. in one single year. We're going to obviously see giant cost with other wars in history, and we're also going to see a situation where in 2008 a great recession occurred where we lost almost as much overnight as our entire economy was worth that year. Not quite, but a good portion of what we did. The 13th Amendment in 1865 outlawed slavery. I guess my point up here is it would have been much easier and cheaper and less destructive in human lives to simply have bought all of the slaves, which is what, and given them their freedom, gradual emancipation, which is what a number of people in the North wanted. The 13th Amendment, 1865, outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment made persons born in the United States, citizens of the United States. The 15th Amendment gave those citizens the right to vote. Of course, this all depended upon whether you were male or not. Many women in most parts, well, women could not vote in federal elections. They could, vote in some local, like city and state elections, but, it would not come until later on in the 19th Amendment that women had the right to vote. So this really applied to males. Now, Reconstruction ended in 1877. So after the Civil War, in an effort to rebuild the South and to turn the South around, troops were sent to the South, and the Republicans in Congress were making certain that the South, attempted to involve blacks in the political spectrum. In a very sad commentary, in 1876, which was the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, there was a national election. And Samuel Tilden of New York, as a Democrat, ran against Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, who was a Republican. Tilden actually got more of the popular vote, but was one electoral vote away from having a majority to win. Hayes did not win the popular vote, and he was like 19 electoral votes behind. So the election was not certain in 3 southern states. The Republicans and Democrats were questioning the figures in those states. So the entire thing was thrown in, as the Constitution required, into Congress, and there was a committee put together. And in the Compromise of 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio was made president. And the compromise was that Reconstruction would end and the troops would be withdrawn from the South. That, of course, did nothing to help the plight of blacks in the South. Racism would persist with groups like the Ku Klux Klan and others in the South, and in the Jim Crow laws of the South that continued to promote segregation of the races. And so many blacks in the South remained poor. Many blacks still were kind of on the plantation, but they were now sharecroppers on the former plantations. Well, let's go ahead just a little bit further in history and talk about a major U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 1896 by the name of Plessy versus Ferguson. This was a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that upheld segregation, that basically came up with this doctrine of separate but equal, that it was legal in terms of the federal government to have separate but equal accommodations for the races. So in other words, if you had train cars and one of the passenger cars was for whites and one was for blacks, they were to be equal facilities. Similarly, if you had at the train station 2 waiting rooms and one was for blacks and one was for whites, they were to be, basically equal. So really, in all public kinds of accommodations, and this could include anything like, theaters or whatever, wherever you were, schools, especially education, that as long as there were separate but equal facilities. Of course, that equal part didn't always play out, and usually very often didn't play out. Well, let's talk about a couple of the major leaders, African American leaders of the late 19th and early 20th century. The first one we want to discuss is Booker T. Washington. He was an African American leader who founded Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in 1881, which was sort of a vocational school for African Americans. He believed that blacks could seek economic betterment, but he believed in accommodation. And accommodation meant that segregation would be okay for a while. Segregation would be okay for the interim. Now that is the view of Booker T. Washington. On the other hand, so on the other side of this argument is W.E.B. Du Bois, an African-American graduate of Harvard University and the author of a book called The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, disagreed with Booker T. Washington. He believed that blacks could pursue their civil rights and that those civil rights did not include segregation. He was one of the founders, by the way, of the NAACP, that is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1909. And, the term colored people in 1909 was considered, something that was preferable to calling them anything else. Now, during World War I, immigration to the United States fell from more than 1 million a year to only 31,000 in the year of 1918. Northern factories needed workers. Labor recruiters set up all throughout the South. And the result of that was the Great Migration. Between 1915 and 1920, 500,000 blacks left the South for the North in the Great Migration. They went to places like Detroit, where they worked in auto factories. And they in turn influenced other friends and family to follow them in a chain migration. By 1940, more than 1 million blacks from the South had migrated to the North. They settled in neighborhoods like Harlem and New York City and the South Side of Chicago. In the 1920s alone, for instance, New York City's black population increased 115%. From 152,000 to 327,000. Now, the fact that so many blacks were moving from the South to the North, and they were moving into communities, and because of segregation, they were really not permitted to integrate into communities, so there were places like the South Side of Chicago and Harlem that developed. And as they developed their own kind of urban culture. This was the era of the New Negro, also known as the Harlem Renaissance, of a pride of being black, and hence a pride in black history and African American art and culture. It was exemplified perhaps best by the black poet Langston Hughes. This was also the time period of jazz, of the Cotton Club, which was a jazz club in Harlem and New York City, which whites patronized as well. And by the way, there was a Cotton Club in Cincinnati as well, in Cincinnati's predominantly black West End. And that is also a place where whites would go to enjoy really good jazz. So, where are we in terms of the civil rights which take place, after World War II? World War II, there were black soldiers serving the United States in World War II, and they couldn't quite understand why, if they had served their country, they shouldn't be entitled to basic civil rights. So you see a vast civil rights movement emerging in the late 1940s, throughout the 1950s, and into the 1960s. And a lot of what black leaders are trying to accomplish is a reversal of that Supreme Court decision of 1896, that separate but equal facilities decision of Plessy versus Ferguson. Truman himself established a Civil Rights Commission in 1946. There were a lot of white supremacist congressmen from the South that certainly were not looking in the U.S. Congress to advance civil rights. The first really important decision to be made, at least against this separate but equal, was Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. Under the then new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that separate but equal in education was inherently unequal. And so the fight to desegregate schools began with this federal decision nationwide. Now, obviously, there was a lot of opposition to school desegregation. An example would be Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. The courts had ordered desegregation at Central High School, but the governor of Arkansas opposed it and sent in the National Guard to prevent it. President Eisenhower then trumped the governor by sending in federal troops to enforce desegregation. Another example was the University of Mississippi in 1962. There, a federal court ordered the university to enroll its first black student, James Meredith. The governor refused, and President John F. Kennedy sent in federal troops. Nearly all of us are familiar with the wonderful work in civil rights of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., pictured here, and of his belief in civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. He was, by the way, the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which proved to be another important voice for desegregation. In 1955, Rosa Parks, pictured here, of Montgomery, Alabama, was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger and to move to the back of the bus where the black passengers were supposed to sit. And this, of course, was a Montgomery, Alabama, public transit bus. Martin Luther King, as a response, led blacks in a boycott of the Montgomery bus system that lasted for over a year, 381 days. 381 days as blacks walked to work, carpooled to work, did everything they could in order to bring the system to integrating, which the buses were finally integrated. Another thing that Martin Luther King led was a nonviolent demonstration at Birmingham, Alabama. There was tear gas and attack dogs and cattle prods and fire hoses turned on King and his protesters. All of this is getting on the nationwide television and shocking, really, the nation as to the brutality which these nonviolent protesters were encountering. John F. Kennedy was proposing civil rights legislation, but the U.S. Congress opposed his ideas. And there were also, at this time, a number of nonviolent sit-ins, such as those occurring by college students at the Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. Basically, the Woolworth was a national chain, a national discount store chain. Back in those days, they called them 5 and 10 cent stores. Today, we call them discount stores. And they had a little lunch counter in a lot of their stores where, you could buy a hamburger, hot dog, and a blue plate special of the day, whatever it might be, and sodas and, ice cream and so forth. And those were, in the case of Greensboro, North Carolina, and many places throughout the United States, those were segregated. Blacks would not be served in a sit-down lunch counter. And so when they were refused service, they just kept sitting there and refused to get up, which of course was affecting business. So the Greensboro merchants began to have the students arrested. So the students actually began a boycott of Greensboro merchants. After 6 months, blacks were allowed to eat at lunch counters in Greensboro, but sit-ins spread throughout the South and the nation, occurring at restaurants, theaters, beaches, churches, pools, etc. And so literally all of those kind of public accommodation facilities where, in Cincinnati and in Covington, again, there were restaurants where blacks would not be served. They might be able to go to the back door of the restaurant, to the kitchen door of the restaurant, and order something for a carry-out, but they weren't served. They might be able to go to Coppin's department store in Covington and buy a hat or buy a dress, but they weren't permitted to try on the hat or the dress. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, was founded in 1960, and nationwide it also opposed segregation through nonviolent means and civil disobedience. So too did CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, which organized the Freedom Rides in 1961. These Freedom Rides were an effort to integrate interstate transportation. Now, by interstate transportation, we meant that blacks and whites would get on buses together, sit wherever they wanted on the bus, and they would start out from a northern city, and then the buses would go south. And when they arrived in the South, these integrated buses were often met by violence. Sometimes they were burned, turned over, rocks were thrown at them, etc. The situation became so bad that Attorney General Robert Kennedy called in federal marshals. So about 400 people nationwide participated in these freedom rides, but because of, radio and especially television, this was seen all throughout the United States. Now, another movement that went all the way back to the 1930s was that of the black Muslims, who embraced Islam, which had always been a popular religion in Africa. By the 1970s, the black Muslims grew to some 100,000 people in the United States. They promoted black pride, and they promoted self-defense against white violence and separation from whites as well. They didn't think that integrating with whites would necessarily improve the plight of blacks. Now, one of those black Muslims was Malcolm X, who's pictured here. But in 1964, he had a break with the black Muslims, and he began to become interested in working with whites and with black integrationists. He was assassinated at a rally in Harlem in New York City in February 1965 by 3 black Muslims. And, this is a very difficult time in U.S. history because obviously there would be another assassination, November 22nd of 1963, when JFK was assassinated. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed as a memorial to President JFK and signed into law by then-President Lyndon Baines Johnson, prohibiting discrimination in places of public accommodation and establishing the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Well, there was still a problem for blacks to try to vote in the South. As we said, all these kind of Jim Crow laws had arisen in the South. In some places you had to pass a literacy test. In many places you had to pay a poll tax. So you had to literally pay a tax to vote. And many could not afford that. So in Selma, Alabama in 1965, thousands of marchers turned out to support the extension of voting rights. They were met by violence. President Johnson had to call in the National Guard. And eventually LBJ would support, not eventually, right away, a Voting Rights Act which was passed in 1965. Still, for many blacks throughout the United States, although their civil rights were slowly being extended and broadened, still in so many instances, economic opportunities had really not broadened. And there were still many poor whites in the United States, not only in the South, but also in the blacks. Some people were getting tired of waiting around for change to come in a nonviolent fashion, and so they turned to more destructive means. In 1965, the first destructive race riots in the United States to occur in a very long time happened in a black neighborhood of Los Angeles called Watts. They lasted for 6 days. 34 people were killed, 900 were injured, 4,000 were arrested, and there was $30 million in property damage. Riots followed in Chicago in 1965, in Buffalo, in Boston, in Cincinnati, in New Haven, Providence, Rhode Island, Wilmington, Cambridge, Newark, and Detroit in 1967. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War was attracting more and more attention and finances of the nation, and Martin Luther King was opposed to the Vietnam War. He was assassinated in 1968, and riots again broke out across the United States. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 was passed, which outlawed discrimination and the sale and rental of housing, and outlawed discrimination in jury service for the courts. Now, the situation of racism and of economic inequality between the races certainly has not been solved since. And we face many challenges today. But I wanted to get you up through the civil rights so that you can read more about the present day and do more research about the present day yourself. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help.